There. I'm learning my way around this. Well, welcome everybody, and thank you for taking time off this afternoon to join League of Women Voters Park Rapids. Um, just a reminder, the League of Women Voters is a 106-year-old organization that has always been nonpartisan. We don't endorse candidates or political parties, but we do educate the voters on relevant issues each election season. So this is a program is part of that and talking about redistricting because that's been in the newspapers so much. This afternoon, our guest is Paul Huffman, who is the League of Women Voters Minnesota Elections and Redistricting Policy Coordinator. And he's worked on the national and state organizations to provide information and resources to support League of Women Voters Minnesota and its members and other community groups to educate and engage the public in participation in the redistricting for Minnesota. He's also our member to the R Maps Minnesota Redistricting Committee Campaign Steering Committee. Did I get enough of that in there, Paul?
That is plenty, Carolyn.
That's plenty. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Paul, and you need to share your screen. And so far, what I've found is that if you start to,
All
there
right.
we go. You keep digging into these folders long enough, we get somewhere.
There you go. All right. Okay. So thanks, Carolyn. And we're overcoming the technology. Uh, yeah, as Carolyn said, I'm the election and redistricting policy coordinator for League One Voters Minnesota. Um, so I was very involved with the last redistricting cycle, which was basically 2020 to 2022. Also very involved in census at that point. And we've really been working on redistricting ever since. It's a continuous process. It's not just every 10 years. Census is actually largely the same thing. We're now well into planning for the next census and planning state budget requests for census preparation and activities. So this is all something that at this point we and our partners are all working on, all year long, all through the cycle. So what I'm talking about today is the redistricting war, and that's what we got right now and what it is and what is it coming to Minnesota. So that's what I'm going to talk about. As Carolyn said, the League of Women Voters of Minnesota is a nonpartisan organization, neither supporting nor opposing candidates or political parties in the level of government, but always working on vital issues of concern to our members and the public. Just because we're nonpartisan doesn't mean we're non-political. These are very political issues. Our positions are taken after thorough, usually multi-year study, review of policy, information, data, and then concurrence of our leagues and members. So it's a very involved process. They're not taken lightly. Many of our positions have been in place for decades. And the political parties' positions vary over time, sometimes pretty quickly, but the league doesn't change that fast. So we can appear aligned with one party or another at a given time, but that can change. And there are times, such as redistricting, where we come into difference with both parties. So that's just provide that. So we will get in and talk about this party, that party, but we are nonpartisan. We're just stating the facts. What we're going to talk about today, a brief review of redistricting, what it is and how it typically happens. I do very long programs or multi-stage programs on redistricting. I was there in Park Rapids talking about census back in early 2020. So I haven't had the good fortune of being back since then. And I think Carolyn was the president then too.
Probably.
I think I
Yeah.
was. I think it was.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway, it was a great visit. You guys do great work up in Park Rapids. I'm going to talk about mid-cycle redistricting, what it is, why it matters, how it impacts representation and voting, what's happening in Minnesota or what's not happening, what comes next. And then I'll talk a little bit about how to learn more and what you can do. So that's, cram all in here in this discussion. Redistricting, very high level. normally performed every 10 years after the decennial census. If you recall, the census is done effective April 1st of the year ending in zero. So 2020, 2030, 2010. So every 10 years under the Constitution, the census is done to count every person in the United States. It's not every citizen, it's not every adult, it's every person. And that's under the Constitution. And so after the census, you have an understanding of how many people are there. Then under the Constitution, the Congress is reapportioned. And apportionment is the process by which each state's number of representatives is determined. Now, Minnesota, by depending on what number you look at, 26 or 47 people, retained our 8th representative in the 2020 census. We fully expect that we will lose that 8th representative in 2030 because it's just migration of people to the South and the Sun Belt states and some of the declining immigration to Minnesota. So we expect that we're going to lose one of those 8 seats, which means that redistricting in 2030 is going to be very contentious. So then, that's apportionment. Redistricting occurs after the census because you have to know how many representatives you have before you can draw the lines. And then that includes redrawing boundaries for representative districts at a federal, state, and local level. So think about all the places where you have people elected by district, by ward, by whatever. Congressional districts are drawn by, that way. Legislative districts are drawn that way. County commissioner districts are drawn that way. Some city councils, which have, for example, wards, they are drawn this way. You got to go through redistricting. There are, if you have a soil and water conservation district, they generally are done based on the county commissioner boundaries, but there's a process for that. There are some school districts that redistrict, and there are 3 in particular I'm aware of with Minneapolis, Anoka Hennepin, and Duluth school districts have geographic districts. So it happens at every level of government. The purpose is to ensure districts have an equal population, 1 person, 1 vote, and adequate minority representation. That's really a Voting Rights Act. And I'll talk about that here a little bit later. The 2 big court cases that pertain to this, and there was a member when I was there in 2020 who was an attorney. He and I had some really great discussions. You got 2 early 60 decisions that really defined this 1 person, 1 vote principle. Baker versus Carr in 1962, that was Tennessee, and Reynolds v. Sims in 63 was Alabama. So, a lot of the southeastern states, think of post-slavery government that's still, I grew up in South Carolina in the 60s. The memory of the Civil War was alive and well, or the War for Southern Independence, as they referred to it. So that's a remnant of that. Ideally, redistricting ensures effective and accountable representation, that the elected officials are accountable to all their voters and they represent all the voters' interests in their district, whether it's a county commissioner, city council member, or a member of Congress, a legislator. That is the ideal result of redistricting. Now, we fall far short of that in many cases. Some of the specifics about how this happens, the process. Census Bureau provides a portion of data. There's a law around the detailed population data, PL 94-171. For those people involved in redistricting and census, that's like they all know that one. It's tattooed on their foreheads. States define the process for redistricting. In most states, like Minnesota, it's done by states legislatures, and the governor approves or vetoes the maps. Then many states, there are trifectas. There's only 2 or 3 states with divided government that do redistricting, but otherwise it's a trifecta. There are a number of states, around 17, that have appointed commissions. There's a lot of different flavors of commissions. Some are advisory, some are political, some are composed of legislators. There's only 4 truly independent commissions: Arizona, California, Colorado, Michigan. that are done by citizens and not by elected officials or people appointed by elected officials. So, but it's a state-driven process. It's not a federal process. State laws describe how this happens, and that's important for mid-cycle redistricting because state laws dictate in general that it happened. They talk about the timeline for redistricting following the decennial census and what that timeline is, what happens when, what data is used, and then gets into how that's implemented in elections following the census. So that's all state law driven, again, not federal law. I would say that political manipulation in redistricting is common. It's not the exception. It doesn't stray necessarily into gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is extreme manipulation of redistricting to provide an overwhelming advantage of one group or party or another. An example of that political manipulation, my own county commissioner districts, they were drawing district boundaries. They had adopted redistricting principles for drawing county commissioner boundaries that were very similar to state redistricting principles that we had promoted and that the state Supreme Court was following. When push came to shove, one of the county board members, who actually was a member of the league at the time, he's no longer a member, said, we can't follow these principles because we'll get sued. Not true, totally untrue. But he was we as a league had taken a position on maps that were different than what he preferred. And I was here to testify on those maps. He basically threw their principles out the window and said, we got to go do it this way, which gave him the represented district that he wanted. And that's not gerrymandering, but it is political manipulation of the maps. City council members do that. Legislators do it. It's all about, they want to have consistency. They want to minimize change of the maps. They want to know who they're representing. And so that really doesn't include what's in the interest of voters' interests in that process. So, and I will just, an anecdote, I think you probably have heard this. Anybody know the first instance of gerrymandering in U.S. congressional elections?
Someplace out in Maryland, wasn't it?
Yeah.
No, it was actually, the one that people talk about is congressional elections in Massachusetts. Well, Eldridge Gary, who was the governor of Massachusetts. Actually, the very first example was the very first set of congressional elections where the Virginia legislature, Patrick Henry, who was an anti-federalist, and he was the president of the Virginia House of Delegates. He and his party, again, anti-federalist, Virginia really liked the Articles of Confederation. They manipulated the districts to put James Madison and James Monroe in the same district, thinking that James Monroe, being younger and he was this famous war hero and all this stuff, and James Madison was this short voice, squeaky voiced guy. But Madison wrote the Constitution for the most part. There was an effort to prevent Madison from taking office. It failed, but it was a very close election. So this has been around as long as America has been. I'm going to tell you what the league's position is on redistricting, because as we get into this, we've got a very clear position. This has been around for 20 years, I think, a long time. We believe the responsibility for redistricting should be in an independent commission, ideally independent assistant commission. The process should include timelines, disclosures that are processed, public hearings, equal population, contiguity, representation of minority groups, promote partisan fairness, and preserve and protect communities of interest, respect boundaries of municipalities and counties. So the keys in that are minority representation, transparency in the process, involvement of the public, and then promoting partisan fairness. and then community of interest. That's the key things in that. And that's when we work on legislation around redistricting and redistricting policy. Those are the things that we hold in mind. Any questions on that before I move ahead?
Yeah, Beth, you're muted right now.
Yeah. How close has Minnesota come to having an independent commission work on redistricting?
Yeah, Minnesota does not.
No,
What
but
Minnesota has, the Minnesota, by law, I'll tell you about, and it's how it's supposed to work and how it does work. By law, the legislature is supposed to draw maps and the government is supposed to approve them. In reality, going back to what I refer to as the modern era of redistricting, which dates from 1960 and the early 60s with Baker v. Carr and Reynolds v. Sims. In every decennial since 1960, we have had divided government. There's not been a trifecta during redistricting in Minnesota in the last 60 plus years, which is pretty amazing, but it's like playing Russian roulette. And so what always happens, with only one exception of one set of maps in 60 plus, 7 cycles, is the legislature and governor deadlock, and then the courts end up drawing the maps. So that's what's happened every cycle. Now that's not how it's supposed to work. But reality, what you can see from history is that if either party had a trifecta, they would draw those maps to their benefit. And the evidence of that is in 1992, I want to say Carlson was the new governor in 92. In 90. He got elected in 90. 92 was a presidential campaign. 1990, Carlson got elected governor. He was a Republican. It was a DFL legislature. The DFL drew DFL-friendly maps. Surprise, surprise. Carlson wanted to veto it, but a member of staff failed to get it back to the legislature in time. So the Democratic maps actually took effect. The Republicans sued. They found an error in the maps and went to the courts. The maps ultimately got thrown out and redrawn by the DFL. The governor vetoed them. The courts then drew the maps. So both parties will do this. So that's how Minnesota law works.
But has there been an attempt to create any independent commission here
Yes.
in Minnesota?
Yep. And we had a bill before the 23-24 session. We had a bill in the 2019-2020 session. 2019-2020 session. We almost got a hearing when COVID hit in 2020. So we've had a couple of bills in the legislature. There was a bill in the 24 session from the DFL, proposed. There was a bill last year. So there have been bills proposing commissions to the legislature. In general, the Republicans have been opposed. And I had a meeting with Representative Torkelson last year. He was sponsoring a bill opposing it, basically setting up a legislative commission where legislators draw it. And his position, quite frankly, was this is a job for the political parties. And that tells you everything you need to know. I mean, he views that this is a political partisan process. Now, it doesn't have to be, but that is a choice. And the legislators feel like, and he felt, and he articulated in hearings, they thought it was too complicated for the public, which we disagree with. He felt that it was inherently political, which is true, but also inherently positive, which we thought, partisan, which we think is not necessary. So this will be back. This is this session 25-26 session due to the composition of the legislature, and also this year with what's going on around redistricting. This was just not the time to try to promote that. Nobody was really interested in the legislature, but we'll be back with this in 28. In 27. This will be back.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for asking. So this is something, in my analogy, when people talk about this, is when women were fighting for the right to vote, it took decades. This is not going to be a quick thing. We're going to have to build an alliance and a coalition and get our bills ready. And then when we have an opening, get that done. Mid-cycle redistricting, what the heck is that? So, as you may know, it was kicked off about a year ago with last summer when there was a challenge from the president to his party to go out and redistrict Texas, one of the biggest states out there, second largest state after California. Redistrict California to give the Republicans 5 more seats. And you can do that. You can draw maps to reach almost any outcome you like, using computers and deep held demographic and election data. So the problem with that is, one, it's not the typical time. And I mentioned there's state laws about when redistricting happens. So you have to work around those state laws. You don't have the best population and demographic data. The best data is right after the census. And so lots of stuff can change in those, in this case, 6 years since the census was last done. Historically, mid-cycle redistricting is done by court orders. There are still litigation progressing from the 2022 redistricting cycle. In particular, Wisconsin is still moving. Washington State is still moving. Louisiana, there's a case that was heard by the Supreme Court last fall. And that was the second time that one went to the Supreme Court. So this has been, ongoing litigation. So it's never really done. Occasionally politically driven. There has been some past mid-cycle redistricting. Texas has done this on a case-by-case basis. Georgia had done this back in the 2000s to strengthen Republican districts, to rearrange lines. Not on a statewide basis had we seen that in any history that states would go and redistrict in the middle of the decade for the whole state as a whole, unless it was driven by legal action. So that's and that's what's happening. There's states. So what happened is you got one state that did it. And so then it's like, and this was somewhat predicted based on one of the Supreme Court cases in 2019, Rucho v. Common Cause was a case that had been to the Supreme Court a couple of times. And in that case, the Supreme Court basically said, you know what? The Supreme Court has no role in state redistricting as a state activity defined under Section 2 of the Constitution, and we don't have any business in that. That actually mirrors a Supreme Court case from 1946 called Colgrove v. Green, which also said that the federal courts had no role in redistricting. So these things come around depending on political winds. So this is not unfamiliar territory. So it was widely expected at that point that was going to be open season on states to see how far they could go with partisan gerrymandering. Because as long as it's partisan and not racial, the court said that it was okay, unless, say courts intervene. Famously, North Carolina's Supreme Court at the time was a 4-3 progressive Democratic majority. And they had ruled that the North Carolina courts were gerrymandered and violated their state constitution, and they ordered the maps to be redrawn. And North Carolina is heavily gerrymandered. The court threw it out. The next election in 2022, the Republicans flipped a couple of seats, and so went from being 4-3 Democratic to 5-2 Republican, and they promptly reheard the case, there was no precedent for that, and threw out the previous decision and said it was okay, the legislature's in charge. North Carolina is the only state where the governor has no veto power over the maps. So legislature, gerrymandered legislature in North Carolina, gerrymandered maps, and governor couldn't do anything about it. The courts were complicit, and that's where you end up. So North Carolina is a 14-2 Republican majority congressional delegation, a state that's roughly 50-50 Democrat and Republican. So you kick that off with Texas doing redistricting. That was followed by California that said, okay, we're going to match you. And then they went to Missouri, Ohio, North Carolina, again, went back and gerrymandered. They found one more seat in North Carolina. They could actually gerrymander a little bit more. And then there are a number of states that are in progress. So it just shows you nationally how many states have gotten involved in this back and forth. A couple of noteworthy things I'll add. Indiana, it got all the way to the state Senate, and the state Senate refused to go along. And the president was very unhappy with that. But the state Senate, they made a determination that they didn't need to do that. It was really to assure a supermajority, and the Indiana congressional delegation, it's already a gerrymandered map. It was just going to be more gerrymandered. It's 7-2 right now. It would go to 8-1. Ohio is in progress. Maryland, I'll offer. Maryland is, I want to say 7-1 also. Maryland has always been very gerrymandered. Maryland, they're right now, the Maryland maps are up to the state Senate to go along with. They've got a Democratic governor now. They've had a Republican governor for the last 8 years. So Maryland, it may or may not go through the Maryland Senate, but there's like one seat to get there. So it's not a lot, but that's the extent. Virginia, they're convening a session in Virginia to draw maps. North Carolina has New York has talked about it. It's uncertain what will happen there. So, that shows you, how widespread this is. Okay, this kind of shows you the changes. Texas went from 25 to 30 in the Republicans. California went 43 to 48 in the Democrats. Missouri got 1 vote for the Republicans. Ohio got 2 for the Republicans. North Carolina got 1 more. They were already heavily gerrymandered, 10-4, got to 11-3. Utah is under a court order for racial gerrymandering. And that is, right now the courts directed them to redistrict. One of the things these states are all coming up against, for this year, is that filing deadlines are coming up. And once you hit the filing deadline, you really can't do anything for 2026. Florida, because it's Florida, they changed their filing deadlines, and they're convening the legislature in April to redraw maps. So to try to get more maps. Florida, I'm trying to remember exactly where they are. Bear with me a moment. I got this written down. Yeah, Florida is currently 20-8. 20-8 Republican Democratic. The goal is to get them to 25-3. So, that's, take 5 more seats from Democrats and minority voters. So that tells you a little about what's going on. Alabama, I'll talk about that here in a little bit. That's a case called Louisiana versus Calais, about racial redistricting in Louisiana. North Dakota is actually Native American communities. There's an issue there. Wisconsin is an action there in state court, which is still being heard. Probably won't get decided before the election in 26. Then Alabama is continuing under an order to redistrict, which they're continuing to fight.
So this might be a stupid question, but so then there's really no way to fight back against that unless the public is so dismayed with what's going on that they vote outside of their traditional voting patterns. Am I sort of?
It's the states that have managed to make a change that have gone to a purely independent commission have all had citizen initiatives, ballot initiatives. And there's, I think, 20 some odd states, 15 to 20 states that have citizen ballot initiative, which Florida does and Ohio does. So there's been no state that's done an independent commission that had to go through the legislature. Now, we had a couple of commissions get to the legislature. All the studies show if it gets on the ballot, it's going to pass. But even the Democrats aren't that happy because they give up power. Legislators in general. But to your point, Elizabeth, that has been the case is states that pass it, they've had citizens are very fed up with how things are happening. And generally they've got a citizen ballot initiative or they're able to lobby the legislature to pass it.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, no, great question. Other questions on this? Okay. All right. So why does it matter? Well, some of this is just basic gerrymandering stuff. Gerrymander maps are not representative of the interests of all voters. What happens is only the party's votes matter. If it's heavily gerrymandered, then only one party's votes matter. What I will say is, and there I'll have a little thing here about the competitiveness of congressional districts. Representatives are chosen by the parties. Fewer competitive races. The Cook Political Report, which is a really kind of the premier political forecasting organization right now, they forecast 36 of 435 congressional races are competitive this year. And that is down dramatically from what it was as recently as 2018 because of gerrymandering. You draw safe districts for everybody. You pack all of one party in a district. That's Maryland. They pack all the Republicans in one district. Ohio's done the same thing. North Carolina's done it with Democrats. You pack them and you crack all the rest of them into multiple districts. You divide up cities like Charlotte, North Carolina, or Nashville in Tennessee, or Atlanta in Georgia, in order to reduce the effectiveness of the votes of the more progressive or liberal voters or opposition voters, put it that way. Question is mid-cycle redistricting legal? Well, it depends on state constitutions and laws. The states that have been able to get this through the easiest are the ones that have been conservative states that really support strong legislative powers. And I would suggest strong legislative powers doing things they agree with. Unfortunately, courts have become increasingly partisan nationally, and that's the trend. New York, after last redistricting cycle, the New York State Legislature tried to gerrymander their maps without going into a lot of detail about the process. And the New York State Supreme Court wouldn't approve it, okay, because they live by a different set of principles that said that representation of voices of voters mattered and the process mattered. And so they threw out the Democratic drawn maps. They brought in an independent map, which actually ended up being much worse for Democrats than the map that they could have had. So that's where it depends on the state courts. It depends on the state constitution and laws. I was surprised at Missouri because their state laws, and they had a state constitutional amendment about specifically how their maps were drawn. And they end around that. The Supreme Court supported it in Missouri. And so that's how that went. Supreme Court is increasingly unsupportive of race-based decisions. I'll talk about that. Louisiana's the example, and we'll talk about some of the cases that have kind of pointed that way and what's coming next. And many states state how and where redistricting will occur. This was called the Air Bud defense. If anybody ever saw the Air Bud movies, and I have not, but in the movies, it's like they have a golden retriever on the football team. And they say, well, you can't have a golden retriever on the football team. And they say, well, there's nothing in the rules that says it can't. And they're like, well, I guess you can. And that's Missouri, because the law says here's when redistricting is supposed to occur. Nothing says it can't do it mid-cycle. And they said, well, we're going to do it because nothing says we can't. And the Supreme Court went along with that. I don't know what the Minnesota Supreme Court would say because our laws are very specific about when and how redistricting is done. Well, the when is very specific in the timeline. You know, the question that I get asked a lot, can this happen in Minnesota? It's extremely unlikely. Nothing's impossible, but it's extremely unlikely. The legislature and the governor would have to agree, which could happen. I mean, if you take the Missouri Air Bud approach, say the DFL gets a trifecta in the 2026 election, and they decide to draw maps, redraw the maps. You know, they'd have to get all the members of the legislature, all the members of their party to go along with that. You know, which would be a barrier itself. They'd have to get it through the courts. And that's a big question mark about the court. Because just think about New York. New York courts were not supportive of a partisan gerrymander. So it's questionable whether the Minnesota courts would go along with that. So that's the why. If you really want to change how and when redistricting is done, you got to amend the Minnesota state constitution. So there's that. So I think it's very unlikely. Nothing's impossible, but it's extremely unlikely. Any questions before I keep going?
Doesn't it just make it hugely discouraging as a voter to think that your vote really makes much of a difference?
Absolutely. And I used to do voter service, and I heard that all the time. And that's the question. And there's a survey that's going to be done here in the next month or two by the state league, you know, really basically understanding people's attitudes toward voting to provide information to inform our activities, our policy approaches. But part of that is, you know, what's a barrier to voting? We fully expect people are going to say, I don't think my vote counts. And the next slide is going to show you why people feel their vote doesn't count, because it does, you know, it's very hard. What I would always tell people is, look, you know, yes, I'm only one vote, but it's like the rain. Only one drop is one drop, but you can get a torrent of rain that can turn into a flood. So you just got to mobilize people. You got to get people on your side, whatever side that is. You know, if you're a Republican in Minneapolis, you're a Democrat in Park Rapids, then you just have to get your candidates to understand and reflect the interests of the voters writ large in your district, not just the one party. So that's the challenge, especially with partisan gerrymandering. So I think that's a great question. Here is, this is also a Cook Political Report. It shows you some history on competitiveness of elections. The graph there on the left side is a line graph of how many seats in Congress were competitive. And that by that, you know, lean left, lean right, plus or minus 5%. You know, back in 2018, it was over 100 seats. This year, it's around 30, 38. You know, back in the early to mid 90s, it was over 200. Over half of Congress was competitive. Today, it's less than 10%. And that is gerrymandering. So look at the big drop after 2010, 2012. That was gerrymandering in 2012. That was the Project Red Map, which was the Republican strategic initiative around redistricting, target the legislatures and the governor's offices, and then redraw the maps. Very effective, very smart, very strategic, very technical, very effective. So it just shows you that the map to the right shows you what percent are competitive. You got to think about how many of the maps or how many of the districts are they have. So, you know, California has like 48 or 50 seats. So something, you know, less than 25% are competitive. You get states like Georgia, South Carolina, Louisiana, none of them are competitive, none, zero. And those are some pretty big states. You know, Georgia has a lot of seats. None of the maps are competitive. None of the congressional districts are competitive. None of them. Alaska's got one seat, so it's competitive. So It flips back and forth to a certain extent. They say Hawaii's competitive. I think, no, it's Brown. I take it back. Hawaii's not competitive. But you get states with a single representative like Idaho, North Dakota, South Dakota. Those are not competitive. Wyoming has a single representative. Just thinking about this. Montana has two now. So it's competitive because one of them is representing the Billings area. So this is why gerrymandering matters. This is why mid-cycle redistricting matters, because it just makes for less competitive, more polarized seats. Elected officials who are really only accountable to their party and a party base. This is also where open versus closed primaries comes in states where you register by party, and then they have a party primary where you can only vote in that primary if you are a registered Republican or Democrat. So you can't cross vote. Minnesota has a partisan primary, but we don't register by party, and it's an open primary in which you just have to indicate that you are aligned with that party's goals, and then you can vote on that primary. So those things all play into this loss in competitiveness. Any questions on that before I move on? And Carolyn, I'll send this to you in a PDF after we're done.
Okay.
This isn't a question maybe that's totally on topic, but under what circumstances could it happen that there wouldn't be a mid-cycle election, as there's been some discussion?
Oh, you're talking about, if somehow there isn't the 2026 election?
Right. That's come up. Our president has mentioned that as a possibility on occasion. It's come up anyway. And would there ever be any time where there wouldn't be a mid-cycle election, or that could be stopped?
That speculation is out there. Process-wise, there's really not a process. Not conceivably, what could happen is the president could declare a state of emergency and establish, some military control. I think if that were to be proposed, it would immediately be challenged in court. And then we'd be into court space about emergencies. I think there is some encouragement in the recent Supreme Court ruling on tariffs, where they were skeptical of the president's ability to just declare anything an emergency and therefore take whatever action he wanted. So I think that's a scenario that's being proposed that are out there. Advisors to the president, not in the government, advisors from outside the government, suggesting he would declare a state of emergency, martial law, suspend elections until order was restored. There's no precedent for that in the country. We've always said, unlike Ukraine, which the president brings up frequently, Ukraine actually has in their constitution that during a time of war, you don't have elections. The U.S. has had elections during time of war. Look at the World War I, World War II. We had elections every 4 years, every 2 years, just as expected. So there's no precedent. I think there's some things in recent rulings from the Supreme Court which would kind of indicate that they would not be supportive of declaring a state of emergency without substantial cause. But that's kind of the scenario. We do have to be on our guard, because I really think that there's nothing there's nothing outside of the imagination that we could imagine.
Mm-hmm.
If you can imagine it, it's probably being considered.
Mm-hmm.
I will mention, I understand the thought process. I mean, I do. I spent almost 30 years in corporate business, and the attitude is always find a way to be successful. Always, always, always. Figure out how the rules work. How do you manipulate the rules? How do you get around the rules? Is there a way to invoke something? And without external public accountability or public pressure, people in business, unless they have an extremely strong moral compass or some extremely strong governance mechanisms, public boards are really good for that. They are going to do whatever they can get away with. And there's lots of examples of that in privately held companies. So I do understand the thought process and why people look at that. But it's, if you are looking at our government as a public good serving the people, the concept power derives from the people, then that approach doesn't hold water. So, and that's kind of what that whole proposition of declaring martial law, canceling elections would have to come up against that. So thanks, Deanna.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, what's coming next? Okay, I've been teasing this along. There is a pending Supreme Court decision, Louisiana via Calais. And in Louisiana and the southern states, and like I said earlier, I grew up in the South. I understand the culture. I don't live there. I won't live there again. I like Minnesota. Thank you very much. The case is Louisiana. They have 8 congressional seats, and they only had one minority district. And so, NAACP and other organizations sued and said, look, there's got to be at least an opportunity for minority groups to have a second seat. And so based on, it went back and forth to the district court, and the appeals court went back. And so they redrew the maps to make a 6-2 map. Well then, and this is, if any of you recall the Harvard case before the Supreme Court, and this is the reverse discrimination. You can't use race in any form on making admissions decisions. And this is the reverse discrimination thing, where white people are saying that they're being persecuted and taking experiencing disadvantages because there's preference giving of minorities. That's where this is coming from. They're saying that it's a violation of equal protection under the 14th Amendment for white people because you're considering race by creating a second minority opportunity district in Louisiana. That the oral arguments on that were in October. There's every indication that the Supreme Court is going to weaken Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act and potentially just send that back to the district court for review. Depending on what that decision, and the guessing is that the Supreme Court's been sitting on this decision because they want everybody to get done with all the monkey business they're doing with mid-cycle redistricting. And so they don't want this to impact the 2026 election. Now think back to the overturning of Roe v. Wade in 2022. That had an impact on the election in 2022. That was mobilizing to many, many people. I suspect this will be mobilizing a lot of people also, depending on how that comes out. Just a couple of reminders. If you think about Shelby County v. Holder, that basically took away preclearance in Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, basically neutered Section 5 about racial considerations in elections and election policy. Section 2 basically has to do with the ability to challenge actions by states and local governments that impact the ability of minorities to vote and to be represented. There was a case called Brnovich v. I'm trying to remember who it was. Brnovich v. It escapes me right now. Brnovich, it was Brnovich v. Arizona, and it was basically Arizona was in court because under Section 2 they had disadvantaged minorities, but it wasn't intentional. Nobody was able to prove it was intentional. Previously, it had been that disadvantage of minorities, it was intentional or unintentional, and that really went back to that preclearance idea for areas that had experienced racial gerrymandering, racial inequity in voting in elections, that they had to get all their changes in laws and redistricting pre-approved because they were assumed to be bad actors out of the gate. So Brnovich basically took the unintended consequence off the table, we're still left with, if it's demonstrable that the laws or actions are knowingly disadvantageous to minorities, then that's actionable under Section 2. That is likely to weaken Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act based on oral arguments. That will likely set off another wave of redistricting for 2028. And all the states that haven't done it yet, they are going to pursue it. So just expect more of this to happen depending on that decision. It'll come out probably in May or June. So things you can do, groups you can participate in, and this is kind of much broader. Women Defending Democracy, that's a program being run by LWV Minneapolis. If you want information, I think Carolyn probably has that. It's been in our LWV newsletters, and so reach out to the local league there, and they can get you information. Next session is tonight. They cover a lot of topics. They have 1 or 2 sessions a week. Very informative.
And they do record them, right, Paul?
Say again?
They record them, right?
I think they do.
Yeah.
Yeah. And let's see, once a month, League of Women Voters Minnesota has Unite and Rise, Fired Up Friday. This is the league, National League's program for mobilizing and action at a federal and state level. Next one of those is Friday the 27th, so a week from this Friday. This Friday is a program, if you're on the mailing list for the Secretary of State's office, they're having a program on preparing for the 2026 elections. So if you're concerned about access to the ballot, access to polls, what federal action might occur, that would be a good program for you to be part of. And then No Kings 3 rally on the March 28th. League of Women Voters is a national partner in organizing that. Our piece of this is nonpartisan. We just think that there needs to be a balance of power as the framers intended between the courts, the executive branch, and the Congress. And that whole thing has gotten way out of balance with executive powers. And that's really the theme behind that. And if you look at the events calendar, League of Women Voters Minnesota, there's lots of activities going on. This event is on there as well.
Yep.
All right. And what you can do. So this is much broader. As I said, with redistricting, we just got to keep telling elected officials what we expect by way of representation, listening to voters about how they draw maps and what the voters' interests are. When we have legislation, which we'll be working on that for next session, amongst other things, I'm sure we'll have at least one bill in there. There may be multiple bills. That's how it usually works. To do something, especially, there's going to be a lot of motivation given the change in the census and what happens there. Continue to work with local leagues to build voter confidence and implement election laws through civic engagement. The key phrase there is civic engagement. Help people understand how our government works, how it's intended to work, and understanding that, and then get people involved. I said earlier, the intent of the framers of the Constitution was that power comes from the people. It doesn't come from the party. But to the extent that parties are defining who gets elected and what gets decided is not necessarily the interest of the people as a whole. So, and then active at town halls, meetings, we have action alerts, sign up for that, and then support other organizations. There's a lot of organizations in this space doing various things. The league, of course, we always, this is the whole nonprofit need is for financial support to support what we do to provide information and resources to you and others. There are other groups that are active. For example, Common Cause is very good at litigation and national policy. Clean Elections Minnesota is very good at programming and money in politics. We work with them quite closely. And there's other groups that you may be aware of who do good work across a variety of areas. So support those organizations. And then invite others, include others, help them become more knowledgeable. The more knowledgeable you are, the better your ability to cast an informed ballot and the better your ability to influence your elected officials. So that's what I have. It's a lot of stuff. And I'll just stop there and thank you for taking time to listen. Hopefully I haven't put anybody to sleep there. And I try to provide some graphs and pictures and things to help make an impression on you about this. Thank you again for your time, and thank you, Carolyn, for inviting me to do this.
Yeah, and thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, I learned a lot more than I thought I would too, because I read a lot, but you have good stuff. Has anybody got a final question for Paul, or can we let him go get his dinner?
I do.
Okay, Sue?
Are there any, like when Texas did this redistricting and then California did, are there any Democratic leading or, Democratic leaning or just are states that are doing the redistricting, or is it primarily Republican majority states?
Yeah, thanks, Sue. Yeah, California is a heavily Democratic state. It is, I want to say, let me look at my chart here. Yeah, California, they got 52 seats. They're currently 43 Democrat, 9 Republican. They read off what they did, and there's big D Democrat, there's little D Democratic. California actually went through a democratic process because they have, in their state constitution, you have to have an independent commission. They passed a constitutional amendment during the 2027 election in California that enabled them to redraw their map to create 5 additional Democratic districts. So they actually went to the voters to get that approved, and it did get approved with like 60% of the vote. So, but still people challenged it in court, and the state Supreme Court said, they went through the process. They put it to the vote of the people, and the people approved it. Texas did not do that. Texas just did it. Missouri just did it. I would suspect Missouri, because they voted down, abortion, there. I think Missouri wouldn't pass because they did pass some redistricting reform in Missouri. But yeah, Virginia is looking at doing it, which is 6-5 congressional delegation, but they have a Democratic trifecta at the moment in Virginia. So they're working on it. Maryland, which only has 1 seat to gain, they're working on it. New York is looking at it, but I think New York's going to pass based on their experience. So there are Democratic states looking at it. The disadvantage that Democrats have is they have fewer trifectas than the Republicans have. The Republicans have more trifectas, and the independent commissions are in 3 of the 4 states are Democratic states: California, Michigan, and Colorado. So, and that's one reason why Democrats aren't really looking very favorably at independent commissions right now, because it's like unilateral disarmament. If you've got nuclear weapons, escalation, what you don't do is disarm. What you do is you escalate also. And so the key is how to get everybody to disarm. And we know that with nuclear weapons, it's very hard to get people to disarm. And I think redistricting is the same way. So hopefully that's more than you asked for, I think, Sue, but hopefully that.
No, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you again, Paul. And if those especially that are members of the league right now would just stay on, I've got a couple of announcements and things like that before we leave. And thank you again for a few members of the public that joined us and I appreciate that. If you want to know anything more about the League of Women Voters, you've got my email address and I think my telephone number there, so give me a call.